Thank you guys for being here. I really appreciate you all coming to this workshop. Out of curiosity, how many of you are serving as pastors right now? You have a good amount of pastors in the room? Okay, wonderful. And church leaders, or you're involved in church in some capacity? All right, well, I just want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank you for caring about the health of the church. It's not always easy to talk about the things that are broken in the places that we love the most. And so I know for many of us, we deeply, deeply love the church. And so sometimes it can be difficult to talk about the hurt that we see in the church, but it is necessary if we want to move the church towards greater healing. Yeah. And so similarly to as Dr. Gerhardt shared this morning, this workshop does deal with trauma. And so my invitation to you as we begin is that you would be aware of your bodies as we go through this workshop. We will be dealing with some heavy material. We will be talking about some examples of churches struggling with collective trauma. And so sometimes that doesn't hit as deep as examples of people dealing with individual trauma. But still, if at any point you feel in your body just this sense of becoming overwhelmed, my invitation is that you would just gently remove yourself and go do whatever you need to do. Step outside, step in the hallway, or you can even just collect yourself where you are. Just take a couple of deep breaths. Because we will be dealing with some heavy material, and I want you to take care of yourselves well. But again, thank you for being here, and thank you for caring about God's church. So when we talk about the church, I'm really drawn to God's heart for the church and why it is what we're talking about matters. And so I want to share with you just two scripture verses. One is from Ephesians, and I believe that it's a beautiful representation of how God sees the church, what God established the church to be, what he calls it to be. And so in Ephesians 2:20 through 22, we read, "As God's household, you are built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets with Jesus Christ himself as the cornerstone. The whole building is joined together in him, and it grows up into a temple that is dedicated to the Lord. Christ is building you into a place where God lives through his Spirit." God is building you into a place where God lives by his Spirit. Okay, is that good? Okay, can we still see the recording? Okay, cool, awesome. Hello. I'm good. Yes, thank you for solving our tech dilemma. I was like, that looks faint. So,
I left my stuff over here.
Okay, perfect. Go on over. So when we talk about the church, what we're talking about is not really a physical building, a physical temple, but we are talking about the people of God, and we're talking about the way in which God draws people together. He reconciles people together through the blood of Jesus by their shared declaration of Jesus Christ as Lord. And it is in this harmony and this unity of the people of God that we find the church. This is where the Spirit of Christ indwells. And it is through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit that we find the body of Christ able to do the work that Christ would be doing on this earth if he was still walking upon it. And so he has instituted the church to be his body, to extend his mercy and his compassion and his grace, and we do so by the filling of the Holy Spirit. Yes. But my guess is if you're in this room, you have two experiences with the church. You have experiences with the church where that has been what you have witnessed, where you have delighted and rejoiced in the way in which the church has been the body of Christ to the world around it. And there have also probably been times when you have seen the church be something very, very different, where you have witnessed a church struggling to fulfill this God-given mission and calling, where the church either seems stuck and it's unable to reach its neighbors and it's not reaching out to the community around it and it seems to be declining in numbers, or the church is causing harm. And both are devastating realities within the church today. Yeah. And so if you've seen this and you carry this weight, I want to remind us of this passage from the book of Hosea, because I believe that this is a beautiful call from God to his church. So remember the story of Hosea? We have this metaphor in Scripture, and Hosea is running off to different lovers, right? She's looking for love and meaning in all these different places, and God calls this prophet to call her back, and it's supposed to be this metaphor of God's interaction with Israel. And here is where I see a message from God to the church today. See, we hear the word of the Lord, and he says, however, in the future, I will allure her, and I will lead her back into the wilderness, and I will speak tenderly to her. For there I will give her back her vineyards to her and return the valley of trouble into an opportunity for hope. There she will sing as she did when she was young, when she came up from the land of Egypt. And right now, in many places, our churches look like valleys of trouble. And we see collective trauma in many different ways, and we're going to unpack what that means. But we see toxic church cultures, we see churches struggling and declining, and we wonder what could happen and what is God going to do? And God tells us what he's doing. He's going to speak tenderly to his church, and he's going to draw them back, and he's going to turn the valley of trouble into opportunities, or some translations say doors of hope. And this is what we want to see in our churches. And so to help us move from this valley of trouble place to this opportunity of hope, we have to deal with what is causing our churches to live in these valleys of trouble. And so that's where we're going to talk about trauma. And so I am so thankful for Dr. Gerhardt and her message this morning, because it just laid this beautiful foundation where I can just come in and step right on what she was talking about. So she mentioned a book. And the book she mentioned in her talk a couple times is called The Body Keeps the Score. Yes. And so when I was doing my doctoral program, which I'm still finishing, you can pray for that process. But when I was doing the course reading, we read The Body Keeps the Score. And I entered my doctorate because of the pain and brokenness that I saw in the church. And because of the hurt that I saw churches either causing or the hurt that I saw churches carrying. And I wanted to know what we could do about it. And so I entered the doctorate program with this in mind. And as I was reading The Body Keeps the Score, I had this aha moment, this sudden realization that perhaps what is happening in our churches is we actually have a diagnostic problem. And so there is a chapter in Dr. Basil van der Kolk's book on childhood trauma. And he discusses this case that he did with some children, and he was working with a group of children, and he noticed that all of their diagnoses, they all had these diagnoses, and they were all things like ADHD, reactive attachment disorder, and all of these behavioral disorders that these children had been diagnosed with. And he and his colleagues were treating them based on those diagnoses. But knowing what he knew from trauma, Dr. Kolk decided to go a bit deeper, and he did some research, and he started pulling back the layers. And he found that these children who were being treated for their behavioral issues actually had this underlying need of trauma. What he called it developmental trauma. And so they had all of this developmental trauma, these incidences of trauma throughout their childhood that kind of built upon each other to then manifest themselves in these behavioral ways. And the problem was, by just seeking to treat the behavior, they never actually healed what was hurting. They never dealt with the real pain. And as I was reading this, it was a very strange moment where I'm reading about childhood trauma, but all I could see was the church. And all I could see were the many churches. I am a pastor's kid and a pastor, so I've been in church a long time. And I just saw all of these churches that had been diagnosed with so many behavioral problems. But nobody had taken a moment to look at the pain that might have been underneath them. And so I started asking the question, maybe we're diagnosing the church incorrectly. Could there be a new way to approach the struggles that we are seeing in the church today? And so the way that I like to think about it is that in very much the same way as what Basil van der Kolk taught us, that the body keeps the score, I truly believe that the body of Christ keeps the score. That there are many ways that our churches are carrying pain and trauma that they have not processed, and it is keeping them from fulfilling the mission that God has given them. So what does this look like exactly? Well, historically, when we talk about dealing with issues of unhealth within the church, there are historically kind of two main ways of diagnosing the problem. And so maybe for those of you who are in church leadership, some of this may sound familiar. So the first one, which I think is the most common, is that of what I call revitalization. So this is this is used for churches that are declining in number. And so you have a church that's either getting older in age, they're declining in number, maybe they've stopped really reaching out to the broader community. And so you have what often happens is that these churches are diagnosed as in need of revitalization. And so the pastor or the leadership of the church is tasked with coming up with a new vision statement, putting together a new mission statement, starting new outreach programs. And it's all really behavior modification centered, right? We're going to change the behaviors of the church. We're going to re-engage with the community outside of us. We're going to do different things to try to revitalize our churches.
Person on the planet right there.
Not even close, but thank you, Dr. Renner. So they are, and so the symptoms that are noted are lacking in a shared vision and mission, lacking in involvement in broader community, and a deep commitment to the past. And so a really popular book on this is called The Autopsy of a Deceased Church. And so in an autopsy of a deceased, it's not a bad book, it's helpful. The problem with it is that it stays at the behaviors. So it just identifies what the church is doing or often what they're not doing. And it never asks why. And so it often identifies that the church has stopped praying together, or the church has lost a connect with the broader community, or the church has quick turnaround of pastors, and there's a lack of understanding of maybe why this is happening. So that's revitalization. The other main diagnosis for churches, this is kind of new, and this is starting to become more popular with more of like the media attention on religious trauma and spiritual abuse, but I call it reformation. So this one is usually what's happening in response to abusive leaders and narcissistic systems within the church. And so this reformation approach is saying we need to reform the culture of the church. We need to undo the toxicity that's within the culture. And this is very helpful and very important. Both of these diagnoses have a place. Both of them are often correct. The problem with them is that both of them fail to look kind of deeper. And so when we have the Reformation diagnosis, they can see the toxicity in the culture, but they lack a trauma-informed understanding of why that culture may be there. And they also don't necessarily understand the suffering that's been imposed upon the congregation through the existence of that culture. So if a toxic culture has existed for a long time, if there's a narcissistic system, and you simply remove the narcissistic leader, or you remove the narcissistic board or leadership system, you're not actually dealing with the trauma that's been incurred by the congregation. And so what I propose is a new diagnosis that doesn't necessarily replace these, but maybe comes under and supports them to give more meaning. Yes?
Can you say a word about what you mean by narcissistic
System?
leaders or-
Sure. So when we're talking about narcissistic leaders and systems, so in the church often so unfortunately some of the ways in which our church measures of success and our kind of church growth movement of like the 80s, 90s, perpetuated a culture within our churches that led to a lot of development of narcissism amongst pastors due to kind of the celebrity view of pastor, the way in which we centralized the role of pastor and made him or her kind of the star of the show. And so people were choosing their churches based on who the pastor was. And so all of this kind of builds up this ego and this pastor who now, so I should say, all of us have narcissistic tendencies within us. So Chuck DeGroat, who writes on this kind of extensively, he notes that everybody has kind of narcissistic tendencies. It's how much you give into them that will lead to whether or not you fully develop narcissistic personality disorder, which is a whole other thing. But we can all lead out of and live out of the narcissistic traits that are in us if we're not careful. And so what can happen is that you have pastors who maybe weren't diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, maybe that was missed, or maybe what is happening is they're operating in a culture and a system that is leading to them putting more value and more weight in themselves and how they're performing and how they're leading this congregation. And now all of a sudden it's about them. And narcissism, somebody defined it and I thought it was really helpful. And what narcissism is, and it's when somebody cannot absorb any shame. And so all of a sudden that person, anytime they are confronted with something that they maybe did wrong or could have done differently, instead of being able to evaluate their behavior, they will project that shame onto the people around them. and they will then make the people who are questioning them the problem. And so, or they will create a system, and this is what happens in churches a lot, of people who then absorb that shame. And so this is what we see in churches that have very manipulative, abusive pastoral leadership, is that they will often create boards around them or leadership teams of people who are enmeshed in the system, and so they absorb the shame for that leader. And so we see that, unfortunately, in the church a lot for many of the reasons because of the way in which we've defined church success and growth. And yeah. So I would say that in order to move from just these two Meg diagnoses to a new one, we need to ask a new question. So we've been asking the church, what are you doing? And trauma research tells us that a more important question is, what has happened to you? So often when we work with churches, we ask, okay, so are you praying together? Do you have outreach programs? Do you have a clear mission vision? We ask all these behavioral questions, and we don't ask what has happened to you.
That's good.
Now, the problem is, because we're asking, what are you doing? And the problem with what I would say the revitalization diagnosis in particular is that it misses unhealth in churches that look, quote unquote, successful and healthy. So the Reformation approach tries to undo some of that by starting to diagnose the fact that there can be churches who are large in number, large in finances, they're not in decline, but still have unhealth. And so when we start asking not only what are you doing, but what has happened to you, now we can begin to move to a more holistic approach to church health that recognizes that you can still be a large church in number, budget, all of those kind of outward signs of success, and still have a lot of deep-seated unhealth within you. And so that's why we want to move from what are you doing to what has happened to you. We also want to move this way because it is a far more compassionate way of looking at the church. It is a far more understanding way of approaching churches. I wish I had this perspective as a younger pastor, because there are many ways where I wish that I could have approached churches and asked these questions instead of focusing on what are you doing?
Yeah.
And so often we're focused on these behaviors of churches, and we're wondering why they're declining in number, and we feel this pressure to help them reach people more, and we haven't stopped to say, what kind of pain are they carrying? What is going on within this congregation that has caused them to operate in such a way that they're not able to fulfill the mission that God has given them? And maybe it's not really their fault. Maybe it's not just a group of people who have lost sight of the mission and vision. Maybe it's not people who don't remember the Great Commission. Maybe it's a group of people who are carrying some really deep pain. And they're living out of that traumatized state. And when we can begin to put these eyes of compassion on, when we can begin to take these churches into our arms and just quietly sit with them and say, what happened to you? It's then that we can begin to move to greater health. And it's what leads us to this diagnosis that I'm presenting as a diagnosis of restoration. And again, restoration doesn't necessarily replace revitalization or reformation. In fact, I would say oftentimes they kind of go together, right? So depending on what's going on in a church, you may find that their need for some kind of revitalization is directly correlated to the fact that they have trauma. And maybe their toxic cultures has created a need for some healing from trauma. There's often a lot of interlinking going on, but I really do believe that we want to start here first, that we want to start by asking what happened to you, and we want to start unpacking their stories and finding out what kind of collective trauma maybe lives on within that community so that we can deal with that. And then that will move us into the behavior places, but you can't deal with the behavior if you don't deal with what's embodied. And so our churches are carrying things that we need to deal with. So what I want to do now, after kind of breaking down those diagnoses, that I want to go into a little bit of an overview of trauma and the way that it works within our body. I don't have to do much because Dr. Gerhardt did a lot of it for me. But I'm going to go into the way in which trauma is embodied and the way that it's embodied by communities, because we're talking specifically about collective trauma. And that has a kind of different element to it. It has a lot of overlap with individual trauma. It has some other complexities to it because collective trauma is also individual trauma at all kind of coming together. You have a bunch of individuals with their own trauma stories bringing it together to one communal trauma story. And so we're going to look at what collective trauma is, how it's impacting the health of our churches, and then we'll look at kind of paths towards healing, and we're going to do a little bit of a case study exercise together and try some other things out together. So trauma is embodied. Trauma lives in our bodies. It is not all in your head. It is very much internalized by every aspect of your body. And so what that looks like for individuals is some of what Dr. Earhart talked about this morning, but we have this sense of being stuck in a perpetual state of perceived threat. Now that word perceived is important because what happens with trauma survivors is that it's not enough to simply remove the physical threat, right? So even when the physical threat has been removed, there is still this perceived sense of being in danger. And that's why our bodies will still operate, if you can remember that picture of the brain that was on the screen, you're still going to operate out of your amygdala, out of your fight, flight, or freeze responses, even if there's not a threat there. Something's just going to trigger it. Your body's going to go back to that phase. The other way that trauma is embodied is through the difficulty of naming the suffering. And Dr. Gerhardt talked about this a lot. And what Dr. Basil van der Kolk notes in his book is that something actually happens in our brain where the area of language development kind of shuts off during trauma. So being able to name and articulate what is happening or what has happened to us, and especially being able to name what trauma has taken from us or how the trauma has impacted us, can be really difficult. You also feel this disconnection from self and others. So Judith Herman and other researchers in trauma will use the word shattered to describe what trauma does. Trauma has a shattering effect. So we feel this disconnection from ourselves. We feel this broken relationship with others. And it can actually lead to some physical illness. Now, what does this look like if we're talking about congregations? So many of these have direct correlations. So I want you to imagine you have this community now, you have a congregation who has walked through trauma. And so collective trauma can be many things. I'm just going to give you a few examples. The one everybody thinks of when we talk about congregational collective trauma is clergy misconduct. So any harm done to the congregation by the clergy person can cause a great amount of trauma. But this is not the only way that collective trauma shows up in the churches. We also have things like church splits can cause a lot of trauma for churches. The death of a matriarch or patriarch, recurring deaths of people without real sudden deaths, the death of a child, a natural disaster that rips through a building, all of these things can create collective trauma for congregations. And so when you have a congregation who has undergone something like this, they've had perhaps a pastor who was emotionally abusive and manipulative from the pulpit. And so you just have a pastor who leads through fear and manipulation, and they use their preaching to lead that way. And then you remove that pastor. Okay, so we've removed the physical threat. Well, now there's still this perceived threat, right? And so the congregation's bodily response to preaching and to teaching or to visionary directives from the next pastor is one of entering into that fight, flight, freeze. And the other one that I put up there is the fawn response. So some researchers in trauma are identifying that there's also a fawning response. And this is particularly true of women and children in kind of abusive situations. And they're seeing this a lot in religious trauma and spiritual abuse, where fawn is just trying to appease the one who's causing harm. Yeah. And so you have either the fight, the flight, the freeze, or the fawn. And so you have congregations who are responding now, and I'm sure if you've been around the church long enough, you can picture some congregations. The new pastor comes in, and the new pastor has this great idea, and they're all excited about it, and they present the idea to the congregation, and the congregation jumps, and there's this fight. And the pastor's like, well, I thought this was a great idea. Or the pastor gives a message that maybe sounded a little bit, and now all of a sudden the church has no forward momentum, and where are we going? It's because there is still this trauma that is living in the body of the church, and so they're operating out of this fight, flight, or freeze response because it's still internalized. Now, the other way that trauma is embodied by congregations or communities is when we talk about, for individuals, this difficulty naming the suffering, right? This is because of what Dr. Gerhardt shared, and the research shows, right, that the language area of the brain is impeded and the memory is impeded, and our brain protects us by not allowing us to remember all of the graphic details of the suffering that we undergo. Now, picture a congregation. What happens in a congregation, in a collective body, is now you have many different, possibly disorienting stories of the suffering that occurred. So everybody experienced it differently. If you have siblings, you know how this goes. You're telling a story about one Christmas, and then your sister's like, I don't think that's how Christmas went. Yeah. You're like, weren't we in the same room? But you all bring your own experiences and backgrounds and perception and personalities to the event. And so now you have these kind of disorienting, so they're already difficulty telling the story, right? Because we don't have all the language for it. But now there's some complexity because now we're telling maybe different stories. And this can be very difficult for a congregation to deal with, especially a faith community, because our shared identity is so much a part of what makes us a church. Yeah. And now that shared identity it's shattered. We are broken from one another. We don't fully know who we are, and there's this need to have to rebuild our shared identity. And so sometimes in this need to rebuild it, we rebuild it around chosen trauma. So when we're talking about collective trauma, there's kind of two forms that it sometimes takes when we're talking about something that happened in the past. And often when we're talking about churches, especially churches with 100-year-old histories, their trauma is historical, meaning it happened in the past. Now, because of the way that it's embodied, if it's not healed, it doesn't matter if it happened decades ago, it can still have quite the effect on how the church lives out its life. So that's historical trauma. Chosen trauma takes historical trauma to kind of another level. So chosen trauma is when the church is seeking to kind of make its own new identity moving forward, and the way that they do it is by creating their identity around their trauma. So now their trauma is who they are. And so they continue to kind of live out of this state. They've made this their story. They've allowed it to become more of their identity. So not all historical trauma becomes chosen trauma, but sometimes in often just survival mode, when they're just seeking to find that shared identity again and to restore that, they build it around the trauma, and then it just becomes this chosen trauma that they carry with them. And so they allow it to kind of dictate their behavior and their values. So that's how trauma is kind of embodied for our purposes here. So I want to do this case study with you. I want us to kind of I'm going to read this, and I want you to maybe kind of turn to the person next to you, and I want you to diagnose this church. And then I'm going to read you another story, and you're going to re-diagnose the church, okay? So this is all you're going to know about the church. And I just want you to diagnose what's wrong with it. So forget everything I just said. Don't try to get the right answer. Just read what I'm going to tell you now, and with knowing this, how would you diagnose the church? So Faith Community Church was a church with a 100-year history. 15 years ago, it was a vibrant congregation with near 200 attendees of all ages. But in the last decade and a half, Faith Community Church has dwindled to a mere 50 people in one dominant age bracket, 50 and up. The 100-year-old building, once a beacon in the community, is in disrepair with a leaking roof and repair costs that seem astronomical. The surrounding neighborhood has shifted dramatically as diversity, both in race and economic class, has increased. However, these changes have not been reflected within the walls of FCC. But rather, many of the congregants just moved out of the neighborhood. When asked, the majority of leaders within the church do not believe the church can survive another decade. So how would you diagnose Faith Community Church? Talk amongst yourselves, and I'll read you the following story. So, this description of a church is how we normally diagnose. We normally just look at their behaviors. So all I told you right now is their behaviors. So now I'm going to read you a different way of looking at this church. Same church. Ready? Same church. Faith Community Church is a church with a 100-year-old history. In the last 15 years, however, it has seen a change in pastoral leadership 3 times. The first pastor to leave had been a beloved leader who congregants still referred to in a positive light. However, information has come to light recently that he may have not been honest with the church's financial resources. That beloved pastor left to assume a denominational leadership role he had told the congregation he would not take if offered to him. Following that pastor came one with a much different vision for the life of the church, and after a traumatic personal health crisis and while on medical leave, he was removed from the pastoral position and given instruction not to speak to anyone from the congregation about the matter. The congregation was in like, given little information about his removal, and told not to speak to him. That pastor was replaced by another who also had many health concerns, who was then removed without much detail. Replaced by the newest pastor, a young 20-something tasked with restoring the congregation's sense of mission and vision. So, what happened? So do you see how the two pictures of the life of the church are very different? Both are true, okay? Both speak truth. The congregation was dealing, if we go back to the last one, because I think I heard a lot of you kind of identifying, right? The church did not respond well to the neighborhood shift. We saw, I didn't explicitly say it, but you could have all probably picked it up. We saw the white flight, right? We saw the racism that they were living out. We saw that, right? This is not healthy. That is, we need to correct that behavior. Yes. But that's all we know. Yep. And so often, that's all we know. Yep. And as a pastor, I can tell you that when you get appointed, in the Free Methodist Church, we use the word appointed, use whatever word you use in your denomination. When you get put in a church, often this is what you're told. Yep, exactly. And then you start to read board meeting minutes. Well, if you're brave, you do. Or bored. And you start to read society meeting minutes, and you start to have interviews with people, and you start to listen, and you start to piece together a story that starts to give maybe some why to what the behaviors that are being seen. And so when we dare to ask the question, what happened to you, we get a very different narrative of the church. And so when we look at this church, now we can see, okay, they have a pastor who they love, a pastor who led them to great growth. But now all of a sudden, some information is coming to light that pastor may not have been the leader they thought he was. But as we heard this morning, denial is easier than devastation. And so now they're caught in this place, and this happens so often with clergy misconduct. I'm going to talk about that a bit more tomorrow in the spiritual abuse, religious trauma workshop. But when we're talking about clergy abuse, so often there is this very difficult ability for those who are not literally abused by the person to accept what they're hearing. Yep. And so they deny it, or they make excuses for it, because how do you take the person who's been your spiritual leader and mentor and all of a sudden decide that they're not who you thought they were? So now we have a church who's having all this cognitive dissonance, and they're dealing with this temptation to just deny what they're seeing and hearing. The other pastor that came after was just removed, had a heart attack, left on medical leave, was supposed to come back, and then all of a sudden the leadership decided he's not going to go back, and they just told him, you're not allowed to talk to anybody in the church isn't allowed to talk to you. And so now what that does is, so now you have a gossip wheel spinning, and so there's all sorts of stories as to why he had to leave, and nobody knows why he actually had to leave. They replaced that pastor with another pastor with health concerns. Can you see how that might trigger? They're all of a sudden, well, our last pastor had health concerns, and then he ended up in the hospital and never came back. And so you have this inability of the congregation to respond to this new pastor and the new pastor's leadership. And meanwhile, they're all still holding to the vision of the pastor from 15 years ago. And so only knowing what they're doing leads to the installment of a young 20-something who is told they just need a new mission and vision. This is, I didn't make this story up. Like, this is lived experience. This is real, okay? This is what happens in our churches, is that we look at the behaviors of our congregations. We don't pause long enough to say, what happened to you? And we try all of the leadership techniques out there. We try every vision program. We try every mission writing program. And we still end up with churches who are struggling. And then we miss when the hurt and the unhealth is in churches who seem to have a really great vision statement and mission statement, but still have a lot of pain within them. Any questions on any of this before we move into healing? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, because the church that I've been at, I just went through something pretty big. So I guess my question is how do we move towards not making an identity of chosen trauma while still responsibly acknowledging it and still responsibly catering sermons for the congregational context that you're within?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. And it's so important. I'm going to get really deep into that because I'm going to kind of go over what it looks like to heal from collective trauma. And one component of it is that it is really important to name, right? To name the suffering. But part of naming trauma, and I brought this up earlier too, right? Part of naming trauma is being able to articulate what it took or how it impacted us. Because healing from trauma, I think a lot of people want healing from trauma to mean restoring everything to the way it was before the trauma happened. That's not what healing is. So healing from trauma, and Dr. Earhart said it really well today, right? Healing from trauma is when we're able to recognize that the trauma happened, but we don't allow trauma to be the one writing our story. And so that's we don't allow trauma to hold us captive. We don't allow trauma to define how we're going to live, how we're going to interact with others. And that's the real difference with the chosen trauma. So chosen trauma isn't really naming it. In fact, chosen trauma fails to really articulate how it impacted us and how we just allow it to be, this is our story, right? And this has to now define how we live. Whereas when we can move through a process of naming and articulating the pain and the suffering which we endured, and we are able to say, these are the things that it took from us, and then we're able to say, but this is who we want to be moving forward. Yeah. And this is how we want to now look into a new future. No, it's not going to look how it did before trauma happened, right? It's going to look differently. Things are different now. But we can choose how we want to move forward together as a community.
Yeah, I was just thinking, what's the difference between not grieving the loss of the pastor that, where do trauma and grief and loss kind of overlap?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So one thing that I should have said earlier that's important to note when we're talking about trauma is that trauma is not the event that it occurs, but how the body experiences the event. And so that makes trauma very subjective, which is another reason why congregational collective trauma is complex. Because when you have a pastor who leaves, or a pastor who passes away, or even if a pastor leaves on good terms, person to person, that's going to impact them differently. And so for some, that grief is going to overwhelm them in such a way that they do experience trauma. For others, that grief is going to be more of just a suffering. It's not going to fully overwhelm their system. And so it overlaps in that grief can be traumatizing for some people. It doesn't necessarily have to be traumatizing for everyone. And that's not a good or bad. It's not one person's better than another. It's just how your body is receiving it. And so in our grief and in our mourning, sometimes it so just overwhelms us that we do experience trauma, and our bodies just kind of have to enter into a time of where they kind of shut down and where we have to then process in a deeper level of healing. And sometimes we just are able to grieve in a different way. So I think knowing how individuals within your church are responding, how the body as a whole is receiving it, and whether or not it's fully just causing kind of that shattering within them that's causing them to feel more of that deeper level of trauma.
And then I would add how does higher leadership, superintendent, bishop,
Yeah, sure.
Whether they're sensitized towards this or not sensitized towards this.
Yeah.
How does the new The new 20-something pastor is gonna be,
Yeah.
really challenged to,
Mm-hmm.
he's gonna need a real spiritual dose of wisdom, I think.
Yeah. So I actually,
And is it possible? I mean, does this need to be someone from a different level of leadership?
yeah, so I would highly argue for, this is like a side thing, but I'm very concerned with the care of congregations after the removal of a pastor or the death of a pastor. And so there's actually a term in research for that. They're called the after pastor. And so an after pastor is any pastor who serves following a pastor who committed any form of misconduct. And what is found is that after pastors face certain challenges unique to them often. And so my advice is that when you're seeking to, in our Free Methodist system, it's called appointing. When you're appointing somebody who will serve as an after pastor, you really want to look for somebody who has a shepherding heart and a shepherding prophetic gifting. You really don't want to put your highly apostolic, evangelical, let's go get it leader in there because you need to put a pastor in there who can do the grieving work and the mourning work and the lamenting work, everything we're going to look at in a little bit. So that's where
Not the big visionaries.
you don't need that person because it's not going to be good for that person. That person's going to get discouraged. They're going to get frustrated. They're going to feel stuck. They're going to get, all of their gifts aren't going to be able to be used because the church isn't ready for that. You need to bring in a shepherd, the APES, the apostolic prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. You need to bring in your shepherd prophet. You're a person who can just hear what's happening, hear between the lines, hear the suffering, help the people make meaning of their suffering. That's really what a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament are doing. They're helping make meaning of the suffering of the people, and you need somebody who can shepherd them through that. So at Restory, I've done training with denominational leadership where I advocate for, okay, if you're looking for somebody to come in after this kind of thing, who are the kind of people that you're looking for now? And often you have to look a little bit deeper because sometimes your shepherd prophets are quiet. And so they're not the first people to put in the application, and they're not the people raising their hand for the job, and you kind of have to find them in their little quiet care for people corner. That's where they are. And so
I think there's a growing movement toward intentional interim pastors.
Yes.
And they often have those skills.
Yes. Yeah. An interim is a phenomenal option, especially. And what an interim does that I think is really helpful is they communicate to the congregation what they're there for. The congregation isn't expecting, because what happens with congregational trauma is that a lot of times you'll have half the congregation who's ready to just move on and they don't want to talk about it, and that's their way of dealing. And so they're wanting somebody to come in and tell them the next thing, even if they're not really actually ready, but they just want to get back to some sense of normalcy. And so when you have an intentional interim come in, what's beautiful about that is that now the church knows, okay, this pastor is here to help us with our healing. There's no expectation on the pastor to bring new programs, to bring new initiatives, to grow the church. They're there to bring the healing that's needed. And that can do that can change this. Unfortunately, it can be hard to find interims because that's a unique kind of position of life. You're not going to if you've got a family and kids, you're not moving every 2 years, right? 2 to 3 years. So to find those people is really helpful, but if you can, it's a great option, yeah.
It's actually required in the Lutheran church.
Is it really?
They have to have an interim. You can't just hire.
That's
and
great.
There's a minimum number of months. I don't know if it's a year or whatever. And they're usually more seasoned, sometimes retired.
Yeah.
Older.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
they come in. They're pretty low key folks.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah,
But
that's
it's required
beautiful.
of every church.
Oh, that's really
It doesn't have
good.
to be it could be someone retired.
Yeah.
They still have to
But
have
during
an
any
interim.
pastoral transition, oh wow, that's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful. We need more of that. We need more of that because that can be really good. Other questions? All right, so we're going to get a little hopeful, hopefully. So how do we move towards healing? So trauma therapists and researchers have kind of identified three key, I'll call them components of trauma healing. I try to not call them phases or stages, because here's the deal. When we're talking about healing from trauma, it is not this like smooth linear journey. It's not just like you step up on this one, then you get to go to the next step, then you get to go to the next step. A lot of times healing from trauma is way more complex than that. And so a lot of times people who are trying to draw it will draw like a circle or a spiral to try to communicate that there may be a time where you have to go back to something that you thought you quote unquote completed, or you think you can maybe go forward. And this is really important for understanding congregational trauma, especially for those of us who are leading, who maybe serve on church leadership teams. Because what I often find when I'm working with churches is that you will have the pastor and the board, or the church leadership, will be moving through the process of healing a bit faster than the congregation. If that's because they've had more conversations about it, because there's more care offered to them, whatever the reason may be, oftentimes church leadership is moving faster than the rest of the congregation. And so when healing is looked like a journey of just checking off steps, if at any point, so the steps that we'll talk about are establishing safety, mourning and lamenting, and reimagining, if there's a congregant or a section of the congregation that all of a sudden needs to go back into establishing more safety because they get re-triggered, what can happen is that church leadership can grow frustrated and think, well, we completed that phase. But that's not how healing from trauma works. And so sometimes you achieve safety and you're able to move forward into some lamenting and some mourning, but then as you're naming what's happening as you're mourning it, you re-trigger some of and so you have to go back and achieve that safety again. Or sometimes you're starting to reimagine what a new future can look like, and you realize, oh my goodness, I never grieved that this is not going to be part of our new future. And now you got to go back. And so if we remember the ebb and flow of the healing journey, it gives us more grace for one another to not be frustrated when it seems like people in our family, our church family, are not as far ahead as we think we are. That's not how healing works. Now, that being said, I will say that there is a starting place. You can't move through any of the healing process without establishing some form of safety. Now, again, safety is both physical and actual as much as it is perceived. So yes, you have to remove the actual physical threat. So the natural disaster has to be over, and you have to secure some kind of church building again, or you have to remove the abusive leader, or you have to undo the toxic system and culture. But you then have to move to a place of perceived safety. And you have to move to a place of perceived communal safety. And so what this often looks like within churches is this often looks like beginning to create space for the pain to be named and for it to be heard. This means recognizing that all of our stories may be very different and that that's okay. So an activity that I will do with churches when I'm starting to kind of begin this process of healing so that we can kind of have this shared sense of identity again and this shared sense of safety amongst one another is we'll do a church timeline activity where I will simply ask them to draw or write a favorite joyous memory. So we start with good memories. We don't ask them right away to go back to the pain. We don't ask them right away to go back to the hurt. But we start with the joyful memories, and we take those pictures and we put them all along the wall, and they get to kind of see them all on the wall kind of in order, and so they get this big timeline. And then I give them those like garage sale stickers, those dots, you know what I'm talking about, the like little dots. Okay, and we have a color coding system. Okay, so all of those, right, are the green. So all of those pictures get green dots on them. They're all joyful, they're all celebratory. And then they have like a red and blue dot. And so without actually having to begin to voice, because remember, we're not there yet. We're just establishing safety. We're not actually fully ready to voice what happened, the pain that happened. What I do is I allow them to have time to look at the timeline, and they take their red dots, and if any point during that timeline there was a moment of communal suffering, they go ahead and they put a red dot up there. Anytime the whole church kind of went through some form of suffering. If there was a time where they incurred some personal suffering, but within the context of the church, they put a blue dot. And then we take a step back and we look at the timeline. And sometimes I'll give them yellow dots too if they want to put up a moment where they observed somebody else being harmed within the church. Sometimes this is helpful when parents have witnessed their kids be harmed at the hands of the church and those kind of things. And what this does is then we take a step back, and what often churches notice that tends to make a pretty big impact and helps to create that foundational safety and restore some of that shared identity is what is often noticed is that in the same place where somebody puts a green dot or a moment of great joy, somebody else is putting a red dot or in a moment of hurt or a blue dot. And people are often able to start to realize that their story and their picture of the history of the church is not all-encompassing, and that there are several other stories coming together. And we start to grow in our compassion for one another, and we start to realize that a high point of ministry for one person may have been a really, really low point for somebody else. And then we start to see where the clusters of kind of red dots are and the clusters of blue dots. And it starts to give permission to people to recognize that the entirety of their church's history may not have all been good. This is important for when we're talking about congregational collective trauma, is because often there is a need within all of us to defend our churches. To want to believe the best of our churches, to want to cling to, if they're still there, like listen, the 50 people that made it through that story and they're still there after all that stuff, that is a committed loyalty to their church. And so often when you have that commitment and they're still there through all the crap, it's very hard to actually be able to admit that maybe there was stuff. And so what we're doing when we're creating safety is we're just beginning to give them permission to see that there is pain in their story and that it's okay to say that parts of the history were hard. That it's okay that they're not disparaging the bride of Christ. Like, I've heard that a bit in my work. Like, you talk a lot about the pain in the church. We can't disparage. I'm like, I'm not disparaging the bride of Christ. I'm loving the bride of Christ, but she's got a hole in her dress, and I'm not letting her walk down the aisle that way. So we need to stop and give our congregations permission to acknowledge the hurt and the pain that has happened. And that's really what we're doing a lot when we're creating safety, is we're giving them permission to say, not all of this has been okay. And some of it has been really painful. And you know what? Your pain may be very different from mine. But that does not invalidate your pain. That does not minimize it. But now I'm starting to have eyes to see that there may be different stories going on within this church. So those are some ways that we create safety. Once we've established safety, the other way I should note creating safety is we have to teach each other to listen. Actually listen. Not hear, not listen so that we can come up with what we need to say in response, but actually just listen. And our churches are not very good at this. So we need to help our congregations learn how to listen. We need to help our pastors learn how to listen, because they're really bad at this sometimes. So we need to create space for listening, for just holding pain and holding stories and holding the suffering. So once we've established safety, then we can move into mourning and lamenting together. And this is what we were talking about with the grief piece. So we need to give churches space to mourn and lament the things that have harmed them. And especially when we're talking about clergy abuse, clergy misconduct. What often happens is that clergy are just removed, and the new, hopefully they're removed. So hopefully the abusive clergy is removed. But then a new pastor is instated, a new pastor is brought in, and there's very little time, if any, given to the congregation to help them grieve and to mourn and to lament what has been done. And so we need to give congregations the space to do that. And that doesn't just apply to clergy misconduct. This has to do with a church split, or a natural disaster, or the death of a matriarch or patriarch, the death of a child, recurring sudden deaths. We need to give our churches space to feel the pain, to mourn it, to grieve, and to lament together. There are some simple ways that you can do this, even in a proactive way. So churches who already have lamenting built into their liturgies are going to do a lot better at this. If you don't just start lamenting when suffering comes, but you practice lamenting as part of the rhythm and the life of your church. And the church calendar gives us ways to do this. I mean, there's seasons to lament. There's liturgies to help us lament. The Psalms are full of lament. And so if we can encourage our congregations to develop practices of lamenting, and then if we can also, as we do that, though, we really need to teach our people what lament is, because I feel like so often that can go, we just say, okay, we're going to lament, but we don't articulate what lamenting is and how it's actually crucial to our healing and our flourishing as people of God. And so when we teach on lament, when I teach on lament, what I like to tell people is that lamenting is when we are so moved by the brokenness around us, by the brokenness we're experiencing, or by the brokenness in just the world or the community around us, that we are moved to tears, and it breaks our heart and causes us to say, this is not how it's supposed to be. But in our saying, this is not what it is supposed to be, what takes this form of lament and shifts it into biblical lament is that as we say, this is not how it's supposed to be, we are turning our eyes to God. And as we set our gaze upon His, we meet His eyes and discover they are also full of tears, as He is saying, this is not how it's supposed to be. And it is in our joining our tears to those of God and our cry of this is not how it's supposed to be to His cry of this is not how it's supposed to be, that we actually move forward to healing. Because we recognize that we're simply joining God in the work that He's already doing. That God is as grieved as by the brokenness that we see as we are. That He is as moved by it, and that He is lamenting it with us. So biblical lament is us joining our lament to God's. And that's when we can see movement towards a healing and a restoration. And so we want to help our people learn how to mourn and lament together. And then we want to begin to reimagine together. So what does it look like now to move into a new future? We recognize we can't go back to where we were. We recognize that things are going to be different. But we also recognize that we do not want trauma to have us captive. That we want to be able to move into a new future. And what could this look like? What could this look like? And so often what I do with churches when I'm trying to work with them through this process of reimagining together is we return to that timeline exercise. So we return to the timeline exercise where we have all of those kind of pieces of paper, and you have all the joyous moments, and you have the dots, and hopefully by now we've been able to voice what some of those dots are, and we've been able to give word to them. And so then we start to involve our whole bodies. Now I hope that you noticed that we were involving our whole bodies the whole time, because they literally had to go put the sticker on the wall, and they're walking through the timeline. So now what we're going to do with the congregation is we're going to start to imagine kind of where we want to go from here. And so we create kind of this, it's not an obstacle course, but maybe it looks like that. So there's the three circles of the three colors, right? So we have the green and the red and the blue. And we all kind of write down on pieces of paper or clothespins or whatever you want to use. You write down things that we learned from there or we took from there, those moments of, so what happened in our body during those moments of joy and communal suffering and individual suffering. And then we put them in the 3 circles, and then everybody kind of goes through and gets to choose which elements they want to take with them. And so we're picking out of the circles. So because the truth of the matter is our suffering, it harms us, but it can also, maybe there are things we learn from it that we want to take. Maybe there are things that we want to leave. And so we decide, okay, what are we taking with us? And then we all kind of walk through the obstacle course. You can picture like a red hula hoop and a blue one. And so in those circles are the things that we've learned and experienced, and we choose what we want to take. And then we get to have a wonderful discussion about, okay, what would it look like for our congregation to live out these values and to leave behind the things that we don't want to take with us anymore. So we begin to just kind of start reimagining who we want to be, who God has called us to be, what it would look like to live out this new future. Thoughts or questions on those? Okay. Yeah.
Can a church or group get stuck in wanting and learning?
Can they get stuck? That is a good question. So, a couple notes on getting stuck. When we're working with trauma, whenever it feels like somebody is stuck, we want to go back to that other question of maybe what happened to you. Because oftentimes when somebody seems stuck in their trauma, what is actually happening is that their body is starting to deal with a different trauma that they're not even fully aware was there. And so you can have symptoms of kind of complex trauma. And so sometimes if a church, so let's say a church recognizes we need to mourn and lament from this particular case that happened with this pastor. But then maybe there's a segment of the church that seems really stuck there, and you find out, well, they were all here when another pastor did that. Or they all came to this church from another church because they experienced it with that pastor down the road, thought this was going to be a safe place, and then it happened all over again. And so before we jump to, oh, they're just stuck, we want to again return to, okay, is there maybe more trauma that the body is unpacking here? And that's why sometimes I say, so sometimes you have to go back to that safety place and go, okay, so what is it that's causing us to feel stuck in this place? And then again, if lamenting is just seen as kind of a complaining to complain, right? Like if there's no understanding that we're encountering God here, that we're moving towards God with it, then sometimes that can become kind of a stuck place as well. And with congregations, you have to remember you're dealing with a bunch of individuals who are also bringing their own stuff, right? And so it often is important that individuals within a congregation may need to be receiving their own kind of trauma counseling and more in-depth trauma work through counselors, stuff that's not really going to be done within a congregational setting. You might need, and that's why the next thing I'm going to talk about is kind of whose job is this, right? It would be helpful for a church that's working through this process to have some trauma-informed people who can have eyes to see when that's happening and can make the correct referrals to see if maybe there's some deeper trauma work that needs to be done that might be leading to the stuckness. Yeah.
You gotta think out loud, because I'm not
Think
sure
out
I
loud.
quite have the words for it. But,
That's fine.
in longing to be ministers of reconciliation, but we're talking about abuse.
Yeah.
Trust cannot always be reestablished. And so there is that ongoing grief of the brokenness that can't be reestablished. And so how can you healthily navigate a congregation where reconciliation is not possible as you move forward in healing from trauma and leadership?
Are you saying when the reconciliation isn't possible between the members of the congregation, or?
Because of harm from a previous leader.
Okay.
Right, who didn't pass away, was abusive, narcissistic.
Sure.
Who still cannot be trusted.
Yes, okay, so the trust is broken with
Right.
the leader, okay.
Right.
So when we're talking about, healing from abusive trauma or healing from trauma, and we're looking at the relational dynamic of trauma. So trauma is almost always relational in that it breaks our relationships with others. And so what is helpful through mending the trust, right? So the trust can't necessarily be mended with that leader who's no longer there. What can happen, and we learn this a lot through like attachment studies, is what's actually seen is that to help mend that quote-unquote attachment, right? So this attachment's broken. We just need more and more safe relationships to help us learn how to trust in other ways. So the more people that can kind of come and help rebuild safe relationships and trusting relationships in a different context can begin to repair the broken attachment that was done by that
thank you.
clergy leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right, so, the computer did something. Oh no. It's okay, they gave me the password. I'll break in. I don't know where any. Okay, good. So, maybe. Okay, well, you're just going to have to all imagine the next slide because it's not coming on the screen. Oh. Woo. Okay, so who does this? Whose job is this? So we've talked a little bit about the role of the pastor. So for those of you who are pastors and church leaders, if you're sitting here and you're going, oh, this is explaining a lot of my church, or this is explaining a lot of the churches that I've seen or witnessed or worked with, or I want you to remember that your role is to shepherd. So nobody is expecting you to leave this room a certified trauma therapist. That is not your job. Your call is to shepherd the people of God that he has entrusted to your care. And so shepherding means holding space for their pain. Shepherding means allowing them to grieve. Shepherding means helping them feel safe. Shepherding means gently leading them to those places of fresh water where they can begin to reimagine. But your role is always to shepherd. And so don't feel like you have to try to come in and be your congregation's trauma therapist. I can tell you we don't have the training for that. But choose to shepherd. And no, I mentioned after pastors. So if you're sitting here and you're going, oh my goodness, I think I'm an after pastor. Or I was an after pastor and nobody told me that that was a thing. I didn't know it was a thing either. And then I read it in a book and I was like, there's a name for this. If you're serving as an after pastor, know that the way in which the congregation does not trust you is not about you. They simply do not trust the office of pastor. Do not take it personally and recognize again that your role, and as much as it might, I don't know, your denominational leaders might come and find me. It's not your job to try to grow the church right now, okay? Like, it's not your job to start new ministries, new initiatives, new programs. Love the people and lead them to healing and shepherd them well. And don't worry about what numbers you're going to have to put on your quarterly report or whatever they make you fill out. Because you are just being called to shepherd. And as an after pastor, that may be all you can do for a while until they are safe and able to mourn and finally able to reimagine. So,
Can I just add one thing?
yeah.
Because now that I know I was an after pastor, years ago.
Yeah.
But here's what happened when I walked into the mess.
Yeah.
I walked in as a female,
Yeah.
and that added a second layer of trauma.
Yes.
As about 10 to 15 young families left.
Yeah.
So people who stayed not only had the trauma from the previous leadership,
Right.
then I showed up.
Right.
And so sometimes it's very complex.
Yes.
And it just takes years, literally years, to establish
Yeah.
It is painful.
It is. Yeah, and I'm so sorry, because that is,
The Lord had us there for a reason,
yeah.
but it was hard.
It's hard and it's long. And that was my next point, is that it's a really long process. So when we started doing this healing work with congregations, so at Restore, we offer partnerships to congregations who are experiencing collective trauma. And originally when we were kind of piloting, testing it, it was like, this will be a 6-month thing. Part of that was because I was pregnant, and I was like, we're going to make this a 6-month thing because I got to have a baby. But it is not a 6-month thing.
Yeah.
Like, at minimum, you need a year, if not more, of intensive kind of healing and journeying. But then, I mean, research and literature around the church that's not even trauma-informed will show you that it takes at least 7 to 10 years for a congregation to fully trust a pastor, and for, if it's a turnaround, for the turnaround to really come and happen. Now, when you add the layer of trauma involved, this healing, this process of moving from the safety to the mourning and lamenting to beginning to reimagine, that is all at least a 1 year, if not longer, intensive process where the congregation is then at least equipped to know their cues and their triggers, like we heard about earlier, where they can recognize, oh, we're going back there. We need to pause and achieve safety again. We need to pause and lament again. We need to come back together and see if we can reimagine again. But giving them those tools and helping them just come to a place of healing is at least, I mean, honestly, the 6 months that I spent with that one church were like 6 months of achieving safety. It's like, we need, because of how complex congregational trauma is, because you have so many different people, we haven't even talked about the ways in which everybody in your congregation is bringing their own trauma to the congregation, and their own trauma is influencing how they're experiencing that collective trauma. And so you have all of these things that you're dealing with. So it is long. And so the encouragement that I have for you is to not go it alone. Don't try to do it yourself. Partner yourself with the social workers in your community, the therapists in your community, the people who are getting trauma-informed care in your community. If you know chaplains in your community, they often get training on this while the rest of us don't. So find your chaplains in the area, find the people in your community who are doing this work elsewhere, and see how you can lean on them to form what I call a congregational care team, so that you don't have to do this on your own. We at Restore do partner with churches. It's one of the things that we love to do to help build that congregational care team so that you don't have to go it alone. But it can be tempting for a pastor to try to have to be all of those things. You're not all of those things. And so don't feel like you have to be all of those things. Yeah.
Sort of, I think a wild card can be, conference or denominational leadership.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, sometimes they can make it worse. There aren't any superintendents here, are there?
Not today.
And you would think that they would be involved in bringing healing, and it doesn't always happen that way.
Yeah. Yeah, so what we found, I don't know if I should say we as Restore, it's just me and my doctoral research. So part of the Free Methodist Church, so a lot of my doctoral research, I'm really fascinated with the care of congregations after the removal of clergy. And so in some of my research, I actually looked at 3 denominations, the Wesleyan Church, the Nazarene Church, and the Free Methodist Church, so our 3 little Wesleyan sisters there. And all of the the denominational leadership all have systems and processes for how to deal with the clergy.
Right.
They don't have them for what to do with the congregation. And in part of it, the reason often, and again, this is just 3 denominations, I have no idea in others, but for those 3, and the reasoning often that was explained to me as I was kind of interviewing superintendents, denominational leaders, is, well, and it was kind of like you could see the light bulb going off in their heads. We're like, that's a gap. Why did we miss that gap? And it's often because they know that they're supposed to take care of the pastor, and the pastor is supposed to take care of the congregation, is often how it's laid out. Mm-hmm. So they're just so hyper-focused on, okay, how do we move the pastor correctly? What does a path to restoration look like? All those things. And then there's this gap left with this congregation. And so that's why naturally often the thing that happens is you just appoint a new pastor and you kind of assume the pastor is going to take care of all of that. Now there is some shifting. I can't speak for a lot of other denominations, but in the Free Methodist Church, I've been working with the denomination to really emphasize the importance of a congregational care team. So actually, if you're Free Methodist, you probably got our newest restoration, well, I don't know who it all went to. It might have just gone to the superintendents and the MEG boards, but we just redid our restoration manual and we added language about what to do with the congregation to the clergy restoration manual and talk about the formation of a clergy congregational care team, who needs to be on that team and what their job is. It's shifting. We're getting there, but it's a gap that's existed for a little while.
I had a similar question, or similar dynamics for the question of like, from a denominational standpoint, second, third, upper level
Yeah.
leadership, when you're talking about a process that requires patience and time,
Yes.
and that you're usually talking about a congregation that has moved into a position of struggling.
Yeah.
Like, have you seen those dynamics play out, like conferences and denominations, like having the patience
Yes.
to allow a struggling congregation to work through this,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, shut
Yeah.
the door, sell the property, or
Right.
do a wholesale change, or
Right.
that type of stuff.
Right, yeah. So it's a shift in how we talk about the health of the church entirely, right?
Yeah.
So whereas we don't define church health anymore by numbers, which is difficult, right? Because the numbers are what we can see, the numbers are what we can count, but so really it's a shift in the whole conversation. So if we can start by shifting how we define church health, then we can recognize that, okay, taking the 1 to 2 years of time in this congregation and not expecting the growth and not just jumping to closing the doors is actually how we pursue health. Because just closing the doors isn't gonna, now you're just scattering a bunch of unhealthy people into other churches. And so you need to just help them heal. And you're not caring for the people well by doing that. You're not actually pursuing church health by doing that. So I've got a whole other thing about how we should talk about church health. That's a different workshop. But reframing how we look at church health so that we're looking at the health of the relationships within the congregation, which will give us then that time to say this is worth it because this is going to get us to a healthy church, whereas closing it might not.
Have those conversations had any kind of a financial discussion, or like support from,
Oh,
conference,
sure.
financial support for those churches to get through that process?
So I have not been in any of those conversations, but I can see where those conversations are probably going to be necessary. Yeah.
It's like, we can say we don't count numbers, but
I know, but numbers, and that's the, you need the dollars to fund the ministry, and it's not saying that numbers are necessarily bad, they're not the most indicator of health. So, yeah, finding different ways to talk about it. But